This fellow and I have not been introduced, but I'm going to take a guess that your name is Jack Kelly.
That's right.
I can see it on the cover of the book that's on the screen behind us.
Right.
You're an author.
I am.
And where are you from, Jack?
I live down the Hudson Valley near Kingston, New York.
Okay, so you travel a distance to be here at the...
Yeah, I saw a lot of trees on the way.
That's a nice road during the day, but at night it's very boring.
Yeah.
That's a boring highway because not a lot of cars that you see and a lot of darkness. So at the Old Base Chapel on the Plattsburgh Oval, the former Plattsburgh Air Force Base, and we're here on this Friday, May 23rd, to hear a presentation. What are you going to talk about, Jack?
I'm going to be talking mostly about my book, my latest book, which is God Save Benedict Arnold, the true story of America's most hated man. And I had written a couple of years ago another book called Valcour, the 1776 battle that saved the cause of liberty, which dealt to a great deal with Benedict Arnold as well, but was really focused on that one battle at Valcour Island, which is just up the road. So.
Right, but he was very active even before that. I know up in Point of Fair in the town of Champlain, he was there and took off heading north from there. And
yep, he even before the war started. He used to trade in Canada and had business around this area and was certainly familiar with the area and Lake Champlain. One of his first major achievements was taking over the fort at Ticonderoga very early in the war, just three weeks after Lexington. He captured that fort. He came up to Canada, captured a British warship up there in the Richelieu River, and really cemented the Patriots' position on Lake Champlain.
And this was even before the Europeans got here, was known as the warpath of the nations as far as the highway that they took.
It was always fascinating to me that Samuel de Champlain, who the lake was named after, actually fought a battle pretty close to where Fort Ticonderoga is, between two groups of Native Americans, and he gave the victory to the group that he was supporting by firing off his arquebus. They call it a very primitive form of musket. So
but to them, it was
very impressive.
It was Star Trek.
Yes, exactly.
We think of Benedict Arnold, but I was looking today, and he was born in 1741. So in 1776, he was a young man.
Yeah, he was still, I think, 34 when he started in 1775, when he actually started in the war. And he was very successful, very wealthy, lived down in New Haven, Connecticut. But as soon as the news got that the revolution had started, got to his home, the very next day, rode off to war.
Okay. Well, we're looking forward to hearing this. This is part of what the Clinton County Historical Association is doing as we prepare for 250, the 50th anniversary of the Revolution, and this will be an important part. And how I'm sure you're going to tell us several times how they can get a hold of your book, right?
Yeah, it's available at any bookstore. It can be ordered through any bookstore or on Amazon or any of the other online sources. And I should mention, I have another book coming out in January, though it's a ways off yet, but it's still part of the Revolution, that is about Thomas Paine and his part in the Revolutionary War. So that another interesting character. The Revolutionary War is full of interesting characters, I've found.
Yes, but you got to do some digging to get the information on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort, and we thank you for doing that.
Okay, thanks.
So thanks, Jack. Jack Kelly is about to make a presentation here at the Old Base Chapel.
Test. Good evening, everybody. Is this just better? Okay. Thank you, Alex. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to our first official event commemorating America 250, the 250th anniversary of the 1776 United States Declaration of Independence and the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Valcour on October 11, 2026. I'm Jerry Favreau. I'm president of the Clinton County Historical Association and Museum and chair of the America 250 Committee for Clinton County. Our committee is working very hard to make this commemoration one to remember and to honor all those who fought for our independence. The Battle of Valcour was a significant battle in 1776, and we are planning a major event for October 2026. I ask any committee members who are here tonight to please stand up and be recognized. And I know there's some of you. That's just a small portion of the people who are giving a lot of time and effort to make make America 250 a major event in this area. And actually, all of you who are here tonight are an important part of the commemoration because you'll be coming to all of our events and supporting us like you are tonight, and that's very important to all of us. So mark your calendars for a couple of upcoming events. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock, there's going to be a ceremony at the Baker Burying Ground in West Plattsburgh, conducted by the DAR, the SAR, and the American Legion members, honoring 9 Revolutionary War members. On June 27th, here at the chapel at 6:30, author and historian Dr. Maeve Keane will present about gender in New York during the Revolution. And on July 11th at 6:30, also here in the chapel, author and historian Art Cohn will present a program about General Richard Montgomery. They're all free and open to the public. Spread the word, bring your neighbors, and watch local media as more events are planned and we start to publicize them. Social media, the papers, the TVs, however you get your events, just watch because we spread the word far and wide, don't we, Helen? We send them to a lot of places. So tonight's program is being funded by a 2025 Special Programs Grant from the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership. They are very, very good to CCHA, and we thank them for all of their support. We want to thank Calvin Castine, who is here from Hometown Cable, and Christian, who's here from Mountain Lake PBS, that are recording our program tonight. Calvin's program will be on his Hometown Cable channel on YouTube, right? And Mountain Lake will be on their Mountain Lake PBS channel, so you can watch for them there. We'd also like to do a special thank you to the Plattsburgh Memorial Chapel for hosting many of our events. And please be generous and make a donation in the little jar at the back of the church to support this historic building. It's very important to us, and we're so lucky to have this space in order to bring our programs. So if you would be, anything you can put in that little jar, it means a lot to them. And now, thank you, and Rich Frost will introduce our speaker for tonight.
I figured nobody's here to listen to me, so I can be brief. I'm happy to introduce Jack Kelly. He's an award-winning writer. His major interests are regional history and history of the American Revolution and military history in general. He's written books on the American Revolution, including including a book on some of the lesser-known people who were important leaders. He knows our area because he's researched the story of the Battle of Valcour Island that we will be celebrating over this next year. Tonight he's here largely to talk about Benedict Arnold. And if you ever want a character who I guess is subject to revisionist history, this is probably a good one. I think he's been reinterpreted for many centuries and will probably be so for many more. I want to introduce Jack Kelly.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Jerry, Helen Erskine, all the members of the committee, and thank everyone for coming out on a rainy night to listen to the talk about Benedict Arnold. I spent a lot of time in libraries and archives doing research, but I've always felt that to be somewhere where history happened really has a visceral impact and makes the past reality. And I've always tried in my writing to get past the idea that the Revolutionary War was a costume drama. It was a very brutal, violent, real experience for very real people. And right out here, a few hundred yards from here, off Cumberland Head and through upper Lake Champlain, were some of the most intense and consequential moments in Benedict Arnold's career, and it happened right here. Everybody knows one thing about Benedict Arnold, and I don't have to say what that is because you know what it is. But I really wrote the book to get across the idea that there's more to Benedict Arnold than the fact that he was a traitor, and that it's important to know about Benedict Arnold in order to really understand the Revolutionary War and how it unfolded. I'm going to talk about Valcour Island, which I think everyone knows where it is, right down here, and this whole area, and refer to it the various times when Benedict Arnold was right here, was operating right here. And the first was really before the war. Arnold had a trading business up in Canada, and one of the stories that was told was that he would go to Canada and buy horses in the winter, and then herd those horses down Lake Champlain and Lake George to get to the Hudson River when it was frozen solid. So he had maybe 100 horses, and they herd them down, and he would take them down and sell them in the West Indies. That's not really a heavily documented story, but it was a story that somebody told about him. He was referred to as a horse jockey by the British in order as a way of indicating sort of a low profession, but in fact, he was a very successful businessman. He had started out as an apprentice to an apothecary shop after his father's business had gone downhill. His father became an alcoholic. And, but Arnold sort of started over, got into the business of trading. His father had owned ships. He sailed with his father. He eventually owned ships and would sail down to the West Indies, over to London, and up to Canada, and doing this international trading. And he had a store in New Haven. So he was certainly very familiar with this area, even before the war. And when the war broke out in 1775, and the news of Lexington Concord reached his home in New Haven, the very next day, he left behind his business. He left behind 3 young sons and his wife, and he marched off to war. He's very passionate about the patriot cause. And he became a colonel in the Massachusetts militia, and 3 weeks after Lexington Concord, on May 10th, He captured the most strategic fortification in the colonies at Fort Ticonderoga. And not only did he capture the fort, but he then went up to Canada on his own initiative with orders from nobody and captured a sloop of war that was the only warship the British had on Lake Champlain, and thereby captured and thereby nailed down the control of all Lake Champlain for the Patriots. He renamed that sloop of war. It's a pretty small ship, but he renamed it the Enterprise. And for those of you who are interested in naval history, this was the first of 8 ships that the name Enterprise was handed down over the years from one to another. The last couple of, I think, have been aircraft carriers, and the 9th Enterprise is now under construction. It's supposed to be on the high seas on 2029. I don't know about the Starship Enterprise, but I guess that's somewhere. So, was this a great achievement? I think it was, because if you look at the map, the British strategy in the early years of the war was to get control of the water corridor that ran from Montreal and down the Richelieu River, Champlain, Lake George, a portage over to the Hudson River, and all the way down to New York. That was the superhighway of the colonies at the time. And the British thought if they could get control of that corridor, they would split the colonies, isolate New England, and win the war. And they very well might have. The sticking point for them was Fort Ticonderoga, right about in the middle. And the Patriots had control of that, as well as the control that Arnold established of all of Lake Champlain. So the other important thing about taking Ticonderoga, was that in the winter, they took the cannon from Ticonderoga, put them on sleds, and dragged them all the way across Massachusetts to give George Washington his first victory by driving the British out of Boston in March of 1776. So it was a very crucial event, this takeover of Ticonderoga early in the war. What do they say in the history books? It's barely a footnote. It tends to be just ignored, not all that important. The credit, when it's given, is often given to Ethan Allen. And it was true that Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys supplied the manpower, but the idea for taking over Ticonderoga was Benedict Arnold. The leadership was Benedict Arnold. And most of all, that initiative to gain control of the lake and prevent Ticonderoga from being recaptured by the British was all Benedict Arnold. The problem was that the histories were all written after Benedict Arnold became a traitor. So the historians would take his achievements and downplay them and say they were insignificant, or his participation was minimal, or his motives were suspect. And that distorted, they wanted to make out that Benedict Arnold was nothing but a traitor. So they diminished all of his early accomplishments. But I think that we need to look at that to get a clear picture of the war. Some of the early biographies even said that he was a nasty little boy, and he must have been a traitor from the cradle because of that. And they were just made up stories, most of them. So then when we go to 1776, we see the great value of controlling Lake Champlain and Fort Ticonderoga, because the British are intending to launch that invasion down the lake. They sent a 10,000-man army over to Canada, and they wanted to immediately attack Fort Ticonderoga and take it over and move down that water corridor I was talking about. problem was that the troop transports that would have carried the soldiers down to Ticonderoga were vulnerable to gunboats like this, which Benedict Arnold had on Lake Champlain. And so there began an arms race in 1776 with the British at St. John's up in Canada and Benedict Arnold building warships down here in Skenesboro. They were building the ships in St. John's because of the rapids in the Richelieu River. They couldn't sail up from the St. Lawrence into Champlain, but they did have all the resources of the Royal Navy up in the St. Lawrence River. And both sides were building ships as fast as they could. Very difficult proposition for the Patriots because it was out in really in the middle of nowhere. Very few shipbuilders in the wilderness in upper New York. Benedict Arnold was in charge of the nautical aspect of it. Horatio Gates was in command at Ticonderoga, protecting the fort, and Philip Schuyler was the overall commander in 1776 in the north. And they were very lucky to have Benedict Arnold because he understood nautical matters, how to build ships, how to handle ships on the water. Gates didn't, Schuyler was not particularly versed in it either. And so Benedict Arnold was really the lead man in the defense in 1776. They were building gunboats like this, which is, they call them gondolas. They were easy to build because they had a flat bottom, but they were really just oversized rowboats. They had three pretty good-sized cannon on them, and they did have a sail, but mostly they had to be rowed because the sail, without a keel, it was very hard to sail them unless the wind was directly from behind you. And what Arnold wanted, and this is to give you an example, this was a replica that was built by the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, and gives you a sense of the scale of it. There's 12 people, about 12 people in that boat. The actual crew was 44. So they were very crowded, and they needed to row, they needed to work the sails, and they needed to fire the guns all at the same time, so they needed a lot of people. What Arnold wanted was these bigger ships. The gondolas or gunboats were about 50 feet long. This is about 75 feet long. Had more maneuverable sails, lateen sails, had more guns, but they were much harder to build because they had a keel and a shaped hull, and you really needed an experienced shipwright to build those, so they were very slow getting those going. Benedict Arnold, in August of 1776, took a partial fleet, mostly the gunboats, up to the upper part of Lake Champlain, and or the lower part, I don't know what you should say, going up or down the lake, which was confusing then. It's confusing to me. So it was but around this area and a little farther north, and he thought the British would be coming down very soon. He went out there in August and he waited week after week after week, and it started to get cold. As you know, people who live up there know September can be fairly cold. They started out with summer clothes on, and now it was, they were wet all the time. There were no berths on the gunboats. There was no hammocks. When you slept, you just lay down on the deck and slept. They were wet all the time. They were afraid to go on land because the British had patrols that were coming down along the lake. So that it went on very, very difficult service. And Arnold and these crews that were drawn from the army to sail the boats kept waiting and waiting, and they couldn't understand what the British were doing, but the British wanted overwhelming firepower, and they were building bigger and bigger ships, including a ocean-going frigate that they had put together that had been under construction in Quebec, and they took it apart, brought it down to St. John's, and put it back together so that they would be able to clear the Patriots off the lake when they came down. And so finally, in October 11th, the British, the word arrived. Meanwhile, Arnold had put the fleet down between Valkyr Island and the New York shore for protection from storms mostly, but also to hide from the British. So he had all these gunboats, and he did get 3 of the larger rogue galleys, they call them, and a few other ships, and were in the bay between the Valkyr Island and the mainland. When they realized the British were coming down and had got a sense of how big their fleet was, and some of this frigate had more of firepower practically than the entire American fleet. Arnold's second in command said, we have got to get out of here, this is suicidal. Benedict Arnold said, no, we're going to stay here and fight. And people have asked me, why did he have such a intuition for the military when he really had virtually no military training? And I think a lot of it had to do with his having been a sea captain. In those days, you had to be very assertive personality to be a sea captain. And you had to think ahead, you had to pay attention to details, and you had to take the circumstances into consideration, and he got to be very good at that. And so his plan was, this is the famous map of the battle scene of Valkyr Island. It's not a very accurate depiction of the island, but this was the American line, and Arnold decided to take his gunboats into the other ships that he had and put them in line and have them anchored, because he felt that the crews, very inexperienced crews, wouldn't be able to sail and fight and shoot the guns at the same time. So if they were anchored, they could just concentrate on firing the guns. He also knew that, or guessed, let's say, that the British would come down only if the wind was from the north, which it was. So as they were coming along the lake in the channel, and they couldn't come in the north because at the north end because of the shoals there. And actually, they didn't even know that the fleet was there until they went past. And then they had to come around and go back into the wind. And the bigger ships that the British had, which you see down in here, were not able to get into the battle because they couldn't tack back and forth enough to go against the wind. And most of the fight was between the gunboats of the British. They had about 28 gunboats, and the gunboats and a few larger boats of the Americans, and they fired engaged in an artillery battle for 7 hours, just fighting, shooting back and forth at point-blank range. Very brutal form of warfare, very bloody. But it got dark that night, and the American line was still there. The British had not been able to break through, but the Americans had expended 2/3 of their ammunition. They had lost one ship, Philadelphia, sunk. The rest of them had various degrees of damage. So now what? Arnold said, I have a plan, another plan. We're going to escape. And the escape from Valkyr Island was almost like a fairy tale. In the middle of the night, in pitch black, they were able to go right through the British blockade down here by keeping close to the shore, escaped, got that farther up the lake, let's say, and there was more fighting. Most of the American fleet was destroyed the next day or two, but the outcome of that entire campaign was that the British invasion was stopped. And when the British did get their army down to actually Crown Point, ready to attack Ticonderoga, they realized suddenly that it was too late in the season. It was already November. They were afraid the lake would freeze behind them and they would get stuck down there, so they decided they would go back to Canada and wait until spring. So it was a complete success stopping that invasion in 1776. And if you consider whether it's important or not, look at the other end of that water corridor in New York City. In August, George Washington lost the Battle of Brooklyn. In September, he lost New York City. In October, he lost the White Plains. The British then pushed him across the Hudson into New Jersey, and then across all of New Jersey into Pennsylvania. And he ended up in Pennsylvania. His 20,000 man army had shrunk down to 3,000 men. And he wrote to his brother, he said, I think the game is pretty near up. And I think it would have been up if he'd had to also worry about an invasion coming down the Hudson River. But instead, Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates brought nearly 1,000 men that were no longer needed at Ticonderoga down to join Washington's army in Pennsylvania. And some of the men who fought at Valcour Island actually crossed the Delaware on Christmas night and fought with Washington as probably his greatest victory over the Hessians at Trenton the next day. So it seems pretty important, this whole campaign in 1776. What do they say in the history books? I can't say it's just a footnote, because a couple years ago this book came out called Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty, which I wrote myself. But I was surprised that when I was doing the research for that book, at how little had been written about that northern campaign. And I picked up a book called 1776 by David McCullough, and I really admire David McCullough. He's a great historian. And he wrote a book about the Revolutionary War in that 1 year. He didn't slight the campaign in the North, he just didn't mention it at all. There's not a single mention of Valcour Island, Benedict Arnold, or the whole campaign in the North. He didn't want to taint his story with this traitor. So it was a little bit of a distortion of history to leave that out. We then go on to 1777. This was Arnold's house in New Haven. He had one of the biggest houses in the city at that time. And he had gone home on leave, and he decided to resign his commission in the Continental Army. He was very thin-skinned character, very jealous of his honor, and he thought he'd been disrespected by Congress because they didn't give him a promotion after Valcour Island. Washington thought he deserved it as well. He decided, well, he'd had enough, he was going to resign. He wrote out his resignation. He rode down to Philadelphia, handed it in to Congress, and he was finished. But the same day that he handed his resignation in, news arrived in Philadelphia that Fort Ticonderoga had fallen to the British. And General John Burgoyne had that 7,000 man army coming down. There was nothing to stop them on Lake Champlain now. They easily took Ticonderoga. They were on the march towards Albany down here. Benedict Arnold forgot all about his resignation. He rode up to join the fight up in the north. He went out to deal with another British invasion that was coming down the Mohawk River. Then he and General Gates decided to take a stand at Bemis Heights, a few miles south of the village of Saratoga, against this massive British army that was coming down. And they fought two battles there, collectively known as the Battle of Saratoga. In both battles, Burgoyne tried to sweep around the left end of the American line, and in both battles, Benedict Arnold was in command of the left division. In the first battle, he fought Burgoyne to a standstill and inflicted heavy casualties. And in the second battle, he decisively defeated Burgoyne and then personally led a charge into the field fortifications, broke through, and put Burgoyne in a position where he had to do what he said he would never do, which was retreat. This is Arnold on his horse. During that battle, Arnold was shot through the leg, shattered his shin bone, pretty severe injury. But General Burgoyne, a few weeks later, had to surrender his entire army to General Gates. There's not much question that this was a significant achievement because it was called the turning point of the Revolutionary War. And the New York Times Magazine, in its Millennium edition, said that this was the single most important battle fought anywhere in the world in the last 1,000 years. So it sounds pretty important. But every account of the Battle of Saratoga, up until recently, the last 10 years, say, every account diminished Arnold's contribution, particularly in the second battle. And it was said that he was drunk, or he was pouting in his cabin, or he'd been relieved of his command, or he never went out on the battlefield, but, oh yeah, he must have gone out on the battlefield because he got wounded, so he was just riding around like a crazy man. These were all stories that got into the history books and then were repeated down the years in one history after another. And it's interesting to see how history develops. In 2016, a letter surfaced on eBay, and it was written by and it was authenticated, and it was written by a militiaman from New Hampshire who was in the headquarters at the Second Battle of Saratoga, and he was writing home to his wife long before Arnold became a traitor. So he had no reason to disparage Arnold or not. He was just saying what happened, and his account gave the lie to all those stories. That Gates and Arnold were simply operating the battle, supervising this battle the way you would expect two experienced generals to do so. Many historians now are coming around to the view that Benedict Arnold really was the key man in this key battle of the Revolutionary War. Then we get to the one thing everybody knows about Arnold, which is that he went over to the British in 1780. This was an effigy that was dragged through Philadelphia, showing Arnold two-faced and holding a mask and with the devil behind him and the nooses on the... and the nation was shocked by this. And suddenly the admiration for Arnold turned to this virulent hatred of him. And quite understandably, that he'd betrayed the cause. And of course the question is, the first question people ask, why did he do it? Many historians have their favorite theory of why did Benedict Arnold switch sides. Some say it was the money. The British promised him a pretty substantial amount of money to come over to their side. Some say that his wife influenced him. He had married Peggy Shippen, who was a loyalist-leaning young lady from Philadelphia when Arnold was in command of Philadelphia, and maybe she had prompted him. I have noted that that's a pretty common excuse we see in our own time, blame it on the wife. But other people say No, he didn't like the French alliance. So he did have some animosity towards the French. Some say he was just disgruntled by the lack of promotion by Congress. My own answer to that question is, I don't know. And I think that Benedict Arnold was a very enigmatic character. He was not introspective. He didn't think about what he thought about. He was a man of action, and he just did things. He didn't keep a diary, very little in the way of correspondence. So it's really hard to figure. I do talk in the book about some of my ideas about why he might have come to this conclusion that he had to change sides, but I can't say that any of them really can explain this 180-degree turn by one of the greatest generals on the American side. And maybe we'll never really know. And I sometimes wonder if Benedict Arnold himself could have articulated exactly why he did it, but he certainly did it. And the story of the unfolding of his plot is really one of the great dramas in American history. He got command of the lower Hudson Valley here, which includes West Point, which is, in those days, of course, was not a military academy. It was a very important fort for protecting the Hudson River. And he offered the British, through correspondence with the British in New York, he offered to make it possible for them to easily take West Point. And in September of 1780, he met in Harrisburg, which is on the east side of the Hudson, and his neutral ground was not controlled by either side, with the head of British intelligence, which was Major John Andre. And they talked about the plan, they agreed on the price, Arnold had drawn out a map of the forts at West Point, had information about the troop deployments and how it could easily be taken by the British. He gave all these documents to Major Andre and told him to put them in his boot on his way back to take him down to the British in New York. Arnold then went back to his headquarters that was on the opposite side, on the east side, opposite West Point, and Major Andre, after some delays, went over on the ferry and was riding down towards Tarrytown here in civilian clothes with these documents in his boot. And he was very excited, and he was very nervous. He was excited because this was the biggest intelligence coup of the war that he pulled off. It was going to make his career and really make his life. And he was nervous because this area in Westchester County was no man's land. It was the American lines were up here by Peekskill, and the British were down in New York City, and he had to make it from one to the other, and that no man's land was patrolled by militia from both sides. Sure enough, 3 militiamen stepped out, stopped him, and pointed muskets at him, and Andre made the mistake of saying, "I hope you're of our party." And one of the militiamen said, "Oh yeah, what party is that?" So now Andre had to guess. He said, the lower party, meaning the British in New York. And the militiamen said, "We're Americans, get down." They searched him. They found the documents. They didn't understand what it was about, but they knew it was very suspicious that this guy should be riding in civilian clothes and have these documents in his boot. So they took him to their commanding officer, Colonel Jameson. And I think Colonel Jameson was a little slow on the uptake because the first thing he did was send a letter by courier to his commanding officer, Benedict Arnold. And And then he started looking over the papers in more detail, and he's going, wait a minute, this is Arnold's handwriting. This is Arnold's, a map drawn by Arnold. He couldn't figure out what was going on either, but he decided to kick it all upstairs, and he sent it to George Washington, the papers, and another letter by another courier. The plot twist came in when the fact that George Washington was not over in the American camp, it was on the west side of the Hudson, but had been out in Hartford, Connecticut, was on his way back to camp and was going to stop and have breakfast with Benedict Arnold the very next day at Arnold's headquarters. And then they were going to go over and inspect West Point together. So we have the tense situation of two couriers both heading for Arnold's headquarters because the second courier found out that's where he could find Washington. Washington coming down from the north, and who was going to get there first? Some of Washington's aides arrived at Benedict Arnold's headquarters, and they said, the general is just up the road, get ready to put on the big reception for him. A few minutes later, the first courier arrived and handed a letter to Benedict Arnold, and he read it. He said to his wife, I gotta go. And he told everybody else that he was going to go over to West Point and tell Washington to wait here, I'll be right back. He ran down to his boat launch and got his crew to row as fast as they could southward, away from West Point and towards New York. Washington arrived, Arnold wasn't there, where is he? He's over at West Point. Okay, well, let's go over and do the inspection now. So Washington took his entire entourage across the river to West Point, and when they got there, they said, we haven't seen Arnold in 2 days. They said, oh, that's funny. So Washington started looking around himself while the fortifications were falling down. There weren't enough men there. Something was off. And Washington later described his own thinking at that moment. He said, my mind misgave me, but I had not the least idea of the real cause. And I think we all understand that feeling. It's like, there's something really wrong here, but I can't put my finger on what it is. And he couldn't because he trusted Arnold. So being the imperturbable George Washington, he went back to Arnold's headquarters to take a nap. And before he lay down in bed, another courier arrives, hands him the papers. He looked at it, he immediately saw what the case was. And he called in Henry Knox, who was his most trusted subordinate. And he said, Arnold has betrayed us. Who can we trust now? And it was not a rhetorical question, because at that moment, Washington didn't know how far this plot went in the army. He didn't know what officers were involved. He sent Alexander Hamilton riding by horseback down the river to try to catch up with Arnold. He sent a message to the army to get as many troops as they could as quickly marching up to West Point to protect it. And then the real drama began, and Peggy Shippen, or now Peggy Arnold, who, and this, by the way, was a portrait of her drawn by Major Andre. When she was in Philadelphia, she flirted with the British officers. He was quite an accomplished artist, and I guess she spent a lot of time getting her hair done, too. So she started tearing her clothes off and screaming and saying that she had to see Washington and they were going to kill her baby. They all gathered around to try to comfort her, thinking that she was having a hysterical fit because her husband had been shown to be a traitor, and they couldn't imagine that she had been in on the plot all along and was putting on an act in order to help her husband get away. And he did get away. He got down to a British ship on the Hudson River, went into New York, was made a brigadier general in the British Army, fought in Virginia against Americans for about a year, burned New London, Connecticut for the British, which was practically his hometown. And after Yorktown, he went to England and never set foot in America again. The Major Andre, and this is a self-portrait he drew of himself waiting to hear his verdict on his, but about a week later he was hanged as a spy. The men who captured Major Andre, the 3 militiamen, were given these silver medals, which were actually the first military decorations in American history ever given out, with the word fidelity on them, in contrast with Benedict Arnold and his lack of fidelity. A few days after the plot was revealed, one of Arnold's aides said, wouldn't it have been better if the bullet that went through his leg at Saratoga had gone through his heart? And the historians down the year have echoed something of that sentiment and said, if Benedict Arnold had been killed at Saratoga, he would be remembered as one of our greatest military heroes. And I think, from the accomplishments I've been talking about this evening, you can see the logic of that sentiment, but I don't think it's true. I think that if Benedict Arnold had been killed at Saratoga, he would have been forgotten. Just like Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox and Daniel Morgan and all the great heroes of the Revolutionary War have largely been forgotten by the general public. So I'm hopeful that as we get into this 250th anniversary celebration, that some more attention can be given to those who did the fighting. Because we're going to remember Benedict Arnold, but what about all the others? And particularly the men in the ranks who fought a very difficult, very long war in order to create a country. And in reading a lot of the letters and diaries of that time, they often note that they thought of themselves as fighting for generations unborn. And they use that term. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind that we are those generations, and they were fighting for us. Thank you very much. I'll just say before, I'd like to take some questions and get your perspective, because I'm sure there's a lot of people here that know aspects of this story better than I do, but I'll have some books available if anybody wants to buy them in the back there afterwards. But if you go to my website, Jack Kelly Books, I have a Substack newsletter that you get a weekly history essay, and you can sort of keep up with what I'm doing and learn more about it. So I'd be happy to take any questions or comments. Yes?
Why did in the book, God Save Benedict Arnold?
I really had sort of 2 origins of that idea. One was, I tell us a hypothetical in the book, that if he had not betrayed his country and had stayed loyal to the cause, that he would have, between the time he was wounded at Saratoga and when he actually went over to the British, he wanted to get in the naval service. He really loved the being on the water and being a ship's captain. If that had happened, he may not have gone over to the British. And I imagine this scenario of him becoming a hero out in the Atlantic Ocean and coming home and people yelling out, God Save Benedict Arnold. But the other thing behind it was, I feel that people should just leave the judgments aside and look at what happened in history. Not to deny he was a traitor, but not to judge him, and leave that to the higher power. So that was sort of the origin. Yeah.
Is it too provocative or maybe chronologically incorrect to suggest that Benedict Arnold was in fact the founder of the United States Navy?
He's never really given that credit for that. Partly because though that was a navy in a certain sense, it wasn't the navy. It was all an army operation. So they built the boats. The men were all in the army. So the founding of the navy was in the frigates that they built a little bit later. So. Yeah.
What brought you into Benedict Arnold?
I had been interested in the various personalities of the Revolutionary War. I always try to look at the events through people. And I kept coming on to Arnold as someone who was just very interesting, very complex. The achievements that I talk about, that I just talked about, are just some of his achievements. He also went up and fought in Canada, went up through the Main Mountains, and so a very interesting character. That was all my main interest in. Yeah.
What about the loyalties of the oarsmen who were rowing him in the wrong direction? At some point, were they chosen for their disloyalty as well, or at some point did they just ask themselves why they were heading towards enemy lines?
That's a good question, because they were simply there to do whatever they were ordered to do. There was back and forth into that neutral area, but so that when he told them to row, he was the general. They just did what they were told. When he got there, he waved and I think I was in that picture. He waved a white handkerchief. Came up to the boat and he asked them. He said, "If you guys want to come over with me, I'll give you a promotion." And there were a couple of guys that said, "Oh, that sounds good to me." And they actually went over with him. But one guy in particular, I think, was in steering the boat. He said, "No, sir, that one coat is good enough for me at one time." So they then became prisoners of war. Yeah.
How long ago did the letters show up that the young soldier wrote telling about Arnold's activities? So it was all positive stuff.
At Saratoga?
Yeah.
That was in 2016. So it was surprising that history keeps, having more information come out, but it was definitely authenticated, and it was funny because he had just fought in the greatest battle in the last 1,000 years, and he starts the whole beginning of the letters telling his wife he's had a cold and a cough, and, but mainly it was just he wanted to reassure her that he was still alive and had survived the battle. Yes, in the back.
Do you think the reason why Arnold actually betrayed us is because he had such an unfettered ego that he had such a need to prove himself that he just went over the British to accomplish that?
That he had what?
Had such an unfettered ego that that's the reason why he went over to the British.
Well, yeah, certainly his ego was a big part of it. I think he was a narcissist. People now would say he had a narcissistic complex, a very aggrandized view of himself. And I think he was the type of person that always wanted to be at the center of everything. And once he got wounded, he was sort of on the sidelines. They gave him the command at Philadelphia, which was an administrative position. And one way to get back to the center of things was to come up with this idea of helping the British win the war and bring peace. And so he convinced himself that that was a good thing to do. But it meant that he was the man doing it. He was the important person now. He was going to decide the whole outcome of the war, and he was going to risk his life doing it, because if anybody had, if the word had leaked out of British headquarters, let's say, that Arnold was in communication with the British, he would have been hanged. And Washington tried very hard to hang him after he went over to the British. But he was risking his life for many months as they went to these negotiations. Was that the reason he did it? I don't know. It may be a factor, maybe the reason is a whole compilation of different factors, but that was my thought. Yeah.
Peggy Shippen was given a rather large stipend after the war for her services, monthly payment by the British government for her services during the Revolution. Was that connected to what she was involved with the activity that Arnold ended up being a traitor?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. She was somewhat of a go-between between him and Andre and the British in New York. And they would send letters back and forth with secret, invisible ink messages written in between the lines. And so she was definitely involved. And they not only gave her a stipend, but all the children, the male children, they had 5 children in addition to his 3 children. His first wife had died, but in the meantime, all their male children were given positions in the British Army, became officers. And that tradition actually went down in the British Army until, I think, in World War I. One of Arnold's direct descendants was a general in World War I. So they did pretty well. Arnold himself was not very happy in England. He wanted to get into the army, but the officers of the British Army actually hated him, both for being a traitor and then for all British soldiers that he was responsible for killing. So they would never allow him to get an active service in the British Army again, which is what he really wanted. So he just went back to his business and died a pretty unhappy guy. Yeah.
His eldest son was killed fighting the French after the war, after the Revolutionary War. But some say that was a major effect on Arnold being depressed and dying as early as he did. Is there anything you could add to that?
And what was it that caused that?
Pardon?
What was it that caused that?
His eldest son was killed fighting the French.
Oh, yes.
And as a result of that, Arnold never really recovered mentally from that.
I think that's very true. I mean, he said himself that it was a great shock to him. His son was fighting for the British Army in Jamaica and was actually wounded in his leg, and like his father, refused to have it amputated. Only his got gangrene and killed him.